The Mass Effect series is a tyrant of a trilogy with a level of interaction between 3 games that's still unmatched to this day. Given the size and lengths of these games, your platform of choice is important as you will be transferring your save from game to game. Many who have played the games on PC like me will know that there are mods that fix a lot of the issues present in the vanilla games. So keep in mind that this video will be focusing on the vanilla experiences, but yeah, the PC versions do have a serious advantage when it comes to mods. I don't want to undermine the effort put into Legendary Edition though, and there's still deeper engine tweaks that obviously mods can't really replicate. If you're up for managing mods, then the vanilla versions will be welcoming, but for new players on PC or on consoles, there's more to consider, and that's what we'll be looking at. The original Mass Effect was first exclusive to the Xbox 360 and published by Microsoft. Then 6 months later, it came to PC, published by EA. Then the PS3 versions released much later and out of order, so they're gonna be where we start. For ME1, all DLC was included on disc, excluding Pinnacle Station since the source code for it was lost. Pinnacle Station cannot be found anywhere but the original Xbox 360 and PC releases. Now since ME2 came to PS3 first, before ME1, this means there was for a time no option to transfer a save from the first game. To remedy this, an interactive Dark Horse comic was added where you get a summation of the first game and select the larger choices from it. This was then released as paid DLC for Xbox and PC. On Xbox 360 and PS3, all 3 games are 720p and they go up to 30 FPS. While the Xbox version of ME1 has slightly smoother anti-aliasing, it notoriously suffers from screen tearing. The PS3 version of ME1 has no screen tearing and an adjusted and updated lighting engine, reduced film grain, and seemingly no motion blur regardless of the setting. Performance, however, is only slightly improved in a few instances, but really both versions have poor performance. Load times are also worse on PS3. ME2 on PS3, according to BioWare, utilized ME3's updated version of the engine, so it has a slightly different look to it as well. However, on PS3 there's worse performance and load times. Meanwhile, ME3 is much more visually identical between PS3 and Xbox. The PS3 version does, once again, suffer from worse performance and load times. And really quick, all 3 games are backwards compatible on Xbox One and subsequently Xbox Series. So texture popping and loading are improved, and ME1 no longer has screen tearing. The performance is still pretty poor on Xbox One, but on Xbox Series X, ME1 seems to be a stable 30 FPS. And now let's discuss the PC versions of these 3 games. The games can support uncapped frame rates, though it's not natively supported, and ME3 also has game logic tied to its frame rate. There's higher resolution support too, but the games are still designed around 16:9. For ME1, we'll see the shadows casted by characters onto themselves are totally absent in the PC version, and really in the end we have a situation where each game looks different between the 3 platforms, and arguably ME1 differs the most between them. On PC, the UI was overhauled to properly accommodate a mouse and keyboard friendly interface, which is nice since there is no native controller support for any of the original 3 games. Mechanically, the Mako can be easier to aim with the mouse, but harder to handle with WASD. And then lastly of the original games, we have Mass Effect 3 Special Edition for the Wii U. Special Edition features a brief Dark Horse comic once again for the summation of 1 and 2's choices. This comic summation can also again be purchased separately on the other platforms. Special Edition also includes a handful of DLC, but the DLC that wasn't there on launch cannot be purchased by any means. On the Wii U gamepad, the game displays a map and lets you map abilities to the sides, enabling you to play without pausing the game as much. Some sound effects also play through the gamepad too. Visually, the Wii U version is on par with the Xbox and PS3 versions, and its performance is generally better than the PS3 versions and much closer to the Xbox versions too. And now we come to Mass Effect Legendary Edition, developed by BioWare with assistance from Abstraction Studio and Blind Squirrel Games. We usually see these kinds of projects get outsourced, and it makes sense considering not many of BioWare's current employees are probably as familiar with the original code or with Unreal 3. When you launch Legendary Edition, you're greeted with a launcher for all 3 games. This launcher features language and subtitle size options. New achievements are featured across the trilogy, and a handful of redundant achievements were consolidated so that they track between all 3 games. All DLC is included in Legendary Edition, barring Pinnacle Station. And this is a big deal because these 3 games have a seriously absurd amount of DLC and have a frustrating number of hurdles to jump through to get all of the DLC. The top Steam review for ME2 right now links to the DLC and the verification key because EA shut down verification on their end. So Legendary Edition bypasses any of this frustration by baking the DLC content into the games. Mass Effect 2 and 3's DLC weapons and armor can be obtained through research and merchants instead of being handed to you right from the get-go. This is barring ME2's Recon Hood and ME3's Cerberus Ajax armor, which are available at the start. The Genesis review comics are also now optional. Now, like we said, Pinnacle Station is missing from Legendary Edition, and so is Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. Mass Effect 3's multiplayer was not popular when it originally released because you were required to play it for the best ending. And not only that, but if you bought a used copy of 3, you'd have to buy an online pass. However, the requirement to play it for the best ending was later removed, the multiplayer pass was made free later in 2013, and you can still find people today in 2021 playing this multiplayer. Hundreds of bugs were reportedly fixed, such as eyelashes in ME1, the Turian who appeared as a human in the original game, and black blobs if you have a modern AMD CPU. However, there is a good handful of bugs that were not fixed. Conrad Werner is still bugged, but that's probably because they addressed it within the game itself. The Paragon and Renegade point exploit in the first game still works, and the Sasari still has human hands in ME2. I wish I could specify more, but again, there were literally hundreds of bugs across these games, and the severity of some outweigh hundreds of others. In ME1, cover is much more functional and intuitive. Sprinting into cover works more reliably like it does in 2 and 3. Sprinting also now shares stamina usage between exploration and combat, and you don't sprint at a ridiculous speed anymore. Squad mates can also be commanded individually, hit markers were incorporated, there's more auto-save spots, the AI for teammates, enemies, and some bosses were adjusted, and melee is now a dedicated button which leads to a more unified control scheme across the trilogy. ME1's combat has been significantly rebalanced. Weapon and ability cooldowns have been reduced across the board, weapon types are now more distinct depending on their manufacturers, many abilities have shorter durations but for the trade-off of being stronger, the aim cones for weapons are smaller, more enemies take headshot damage, and sniper rifles don't sway anymore. Bonus talents can't be applied until you've completed a playthrough now, ammo mods continue to drop at late game and can now be purchased from merchants, and all weapons can now be used by any class without penalties, but training and upgrading the weapons is still class specific. Meanwhile, in ME2, ammo drops are significantly increased, morality checks were made less strict, and loading screens aren't arbitrarily lengthened by pre-rendered loading screens anymore. Nothing major was rebalanced about ME3's combat, though the whole trilogy did receive additional cover and subtle adjustments to how cover functions. New to ME1 is the Legendary Mode level scaling. The original level cap was 60, but in LE it can be set to 30, making the cap much easier to hit in one playthrough. On top of this, additional difficulty modes are now available from the get-go. ME3's War Asset mechanic has been heavily reworked. Effective military strength and readiness are actually totally gone, and points were rebalanced in a way where if you've played through all 3 games, you'll have a much easier time acquiring the best endings. Now this is the part where we talk about the Mako in ME1. Its controls have been significantly overhauled and improved, especially compared to the original console's controls. You can aim below the barrel now, the Mako is a bit heavier, there's a speed boost now which has a separate cooldown from the jump, more accurate aiming, improved shield recharging and repairing while moving, you can drive on lava without immediately failing a mission now, and XP earned while in the Mako is no longer halved. Character creation and face codes were unified so your character will more naturally go between the games. In addition, there's more skin tones, eye colors, makeup, and hairstyles that were incorporated. Face codes from the original game should work for ME1, though they'll have different levels of compatibility. You can still use scars in ME1, but they simply won't transfer to 2 and 3. And as far as the default characters are concerned, Male Shep has the same level of facial hair all throughout the trilogy, and Femme Shep keeps her ME3 hair in 1 and 2, while the style from 1 and 2 was made a preset. And more casual outfits were added to ME2, some of which came from ME3. The UI of ME1 was totally overhauled to resemble what has worked about the UI design of the later games. ME1 retains its equipment setup and now features sorting, filtering, and the ability to mark certain equipment as junk to sell or break them down for Omnigel later. A handful of camera angles were changed for varying reasons. from the decision that Miranda's ass isn't necessary to simply ensure subtitles weren't obstructing characters, or to just simply utilize stronger framing technique. All three games see higher resolution and more consistent assets, updated shaders for eyes, hair, and skin, overhauled lighting, re-rendered or AI upscaled pre-rendered cutscenes, and even selective use of real-time reflections. ME1 sees the most visual changes, visual elements such as tone mapping, volumetrics, bloom, subsurface scattering, light bouncing, ambient occlusion, film grain, motion blur, and dynamic shadows were all either enhanced and or added. Assets backported from ME3 to 1 and 2 were done in moderation, as lore-wise it wouldn't make sense for, let's say, the Cerberus logo, Alliance uniforms, Anderson, Liara, or Ashley to appear in prior games how they appeared in the later ones. One odd exception to this is Kelly Chambers. Her appearance in 2 was updated to her appearance in 3. ME1's levels had additional details incorporated, functionality changes implemented, and adjusted lighting. So for example, Novaria's Snowstorm is much stronger, and the boss battle area was made wider with more cover. Additionally, Thresher Maws have a visible trail for where they're going now, and enemy missile launchers were slowed down and their effects were toned down a bit so that they don't obstruct your view as hard. And to truly show off the graphical fidelity, a photo mode is present now in all three games, with many options you'd want in your photo mode like focal length and f-stop, as well as some filters. Legendary Edition features two quality options on console, favor quality and favor frame rate. Now, in an odd callback to ME1 on 360, when you choose favor frame rate, you're gonna see screen tearing across the whole trilogy. Load times across the board for the Legendary Edition are vastly improved over the original versions. The notorious elevator rides of ME1, for example, can now be skipped. But if you don't skip them, you'll hear dialogue and new announcements much earlier. On PS4, when you have favor quality enabled, you will get 1080p and up to 30 FPS, while favor frame rate will be 1080p up to 60 FPS. Again, with screen tearing. On PS4 Pro and Xbox One S and Xbox One X, favor quality will be 4K up to 30 FPS, and favor frame rate will be 1440p up to 30 FPS. PS5 has favor quality at 4K up to 60 FPS, and favor frame rate is 1440p up to 60 FPS. On Xbox Series X, for favor quality you will get 4K at a stable 60 FPS, and favor frame rate will be 1440p up to 120 FPS. And then on PC we have 4K with ultra-wide support and up to 240 FPS. The graphics settings have been unified, so all three games get monitor switching, anti-aliasing, and ambient occlusion toggles, but lose their unique settings. You can still work with the INI files though, of course. ME3 didn't have that many settings in the first place, so it actually just has more graphics settings than before now. Funny enough, now that the PC version has native controller support, the console UI is not used when using a controller, so they put the work in to adapt the PC interface to being manageable with a controller. Audio-wise, many subtle audio adjustments were made, like additional sound effects in cutscenes or in ME1's ambience. Sound effects were rebalanced and music is not as compressed anymore. And to me, it sounded like many new voice takes are heard during the combat in ME1. Either these were supposed to originally have been used or are simply outtakes. But generally, combat feels livelier since you're hearing more dialogue. The Mass Effect trilogy has a very deliberate art style with its stark contrast of tones and colors. So all these new visual elements can arguably deviate from the intended art style for the sake of visual fidelity, so it could just be subjective whether one prefers the new or old look. While I'm a fan of how Legendary Edition looks as is, playing it with HDR enabled does kinda restore some of that higher contrast look. I'll at least say that ME1's got some of the nicest HDR I have seen. Outside of visuals though, there is a lot to consider with the vast amount of rebalancing, quality of life changes, and consistency changes across the entire trilogy. Legendary Edition is simply a more accessible package. Many who already own the original games and their DLC may not be as swayed to replay all of these games considering their pre-existing mod support. But if you're a new player, then Legendary Edition seems to cater more towards you. And that about does it for this video. If you want to support future videos or keep up to date on what I'm doing, you can find me on Twitter or support me on Patreon. The next planned video is for Legend of Mana, so until next time, thank you for watching.